For the second session now, it is my great honor and pleasure to introduce Ms.Ervin. Ms.Ervin is an organizer who has been working for over a decade in movements both for trans self-determination as well as prison industrial complex abolition. She's originally from Memphis and started organizing in 2007 in Chicago, supporting homeless, queer, and trans youth at the Broadway Youth Center. Woods is currently staff at Critical Resistance, an organization dedicated to prison industrial complex abolition, where she has been a volunteer member since 2010. As a member of Critical Resistance, she participated in the grassroots fight to stop gang injunctions in 2011, was a core organizer in the fight to stop new jail construction in San Francisco in 2014 and 2015, and a strategist in the campaign to stop Urban Shield, the largest militarized policing and SWAT training at that time. Woods has most recently worked with TGI Justice Project, an abolitionist organization that supports currently and formerly incarcerated trans people, and engaged in research at the PIC at Interrupting Criminalization, an organization that engages in research and projects to fight the prison industrial complex. While at TGIJP, from 2014 to 2018, she helped develop the internal infrastructure of the organization, growing it in size and capacity to strengthen the organization's ability to engage in leadership development and campaigning during the initial Black Lives Matter uprisings and mobilizations, as well as the movements for transgender rights and liberalization. During her time at IC, Woods conducted research on rates of incarceration of Black women and girls and the links between COVID responses and imprisonment and defund the police movement. She also supported organizing on the ground in Minneapolis during the 2020 uprisings. Woods has been interviewed and written for many publications, and as a staff at CR, she's currently working on a campaign to close 10 prisons in California, as well as a campaign in New York State to end all contracts with US Immigration and Customs Enforcement. So I will hand over to Woods now. We are all very excited to hear your thoughts on this very important theme, I think.
Thank you so much for introducing me, and thank you all so much for having me. So I'm just going to start by giving a few comments, and then I'll take questions. Just jump into it. Okay, so given this stage of capitalism, the particular balance of political forces in the Bay Area and what that means for Black people here, there are many issues that are at the forefront of our minds. I don't think that we differ that much, though, from what we're seeing in on the national stage. So per multiple polls done by Black people for the upcoming election, the issues that come up that we care most about are the economy and economic security, housing, and the criminal legal system, right, as was just mentioned. So I'll be focusing my talk and comments on the issues of the criminal legal system, given that this is what I work around, but you'll see some of the ways in which some of the other issues are also intertwined in there. We all know that there was an economic crisis in the year 2008, particularly that the housing bubble burst, setting off a chain reaction through multiple communities. But that had a particular impact on Black communities and the wealth per household. This fact and the contradiction of having Obama as president at the time contributed to the sense of destabilization and unrest and unfairness in Black communities, leading ultimately to the rupture in 2014, that set the stage for the rupture in 2014 and the emergence of the Black Lives Matter movement, and giving room to for lots of leftist and progressive issues to enter the mainstream, right? I'm going to move us through three areas that represent terrains of struggle in the fight against incarceration, and share what fights have looked like here in the Bay Area in the last decade, a little bit about what we're working on now, and what I think the future might look like in just the realms of policing, jailing, and imprisonment. So the last decade has opened up some possibilities, even with the rise and consolidation of the far right from the base up through the current presidential candidate, or one of the current presidential candidates. So during this last decade, Critical Resistance, the organization I work for, was able to, as was said earlier, end Urban Shield, which was at the time in 2016 the largest policing training, militarized policing training that existed at the time, right? So it was happening here, it was happening annually on September 11th, and it would pull together policing and SWAT teams from across the country and some militarized police units from across the world. They would all come, they would trade tactics, tools, hardware, technology, and then leave more deadly, right? And it would also, this was done with what was essentially all of the emergency preparedness funds for the county. So the county was supposed to be using funds for earthquake preparedness, pandemic preparedness, floods, anything like that. All of that was going to Urban Shield, right? So we were able to wage a 5 to 6 year campaign, 6 years, a campaign to end it, to have those funds redistributed back to what is actually needed for emergency preparedness, right? And in 2020, the uprising saw the propulsion of the campaign that was launched by the Anti-Police Terror Project, which is defund policing, onto the national stage after the uprisings in Minneapolis brought attention to the issue of policing and the deadly impacts of policing on everyone, but particularly the Black population, right? And there were multiple, that campaign was picked up in multiple places across the country. But since 2022, there's been a media exacerbated narrative about a rise in crime across the country. And this threatens some of the gains that we've made the last 10 years, nationally, but also here in the Bay Area. There's been challenges to moving some of the campaigns around defund police forward. I think the city that's been able to maintain its gains actually has been Minneapolis, but a lot of us have had our gains rolled back, though some of the work that Anti-Police Terror Project has been doing in at least Oakland around community-based response without policing has endured, or community-based response to crisis that is provided by healthcare professionals as opposed to police. That still exists. But there's now a current project to build a cop city similar to a project that is occurring in Atlanta. And there's organizing that's come together to fight it. And we should all support that, that given the expansion of militarized policing that will not just occur in San Pablo, which is where the actual facility is going to be built, but then also all the police forces across the Bay Area that will move and be trained there and then come out and learn deadlier tactics to police our communities. So there's a lot going on in the anti-policing arena, and though there is still some work to be done around trying to revive some of the fights around defund, but also some of the other anti-policing work, just the amount of cop cities that have popped up. I think right now there are 83 listed facilities across the country at this moment. So this is there's coordination happening, and rapidly. That rapid emergence is truly scary. Okay, so on the topic of jails, the last decade of progressive opening meant that there were some advances that were able to be made in the terrain for fighting jails. In 2015, a coalition was able to come together and stop a jail from being built in San Francisco. It was being built with state funds. And in 2020, we were also able to secure an agreement that San Francisco would close that same jail, which was falling apart, because the population inside was dropping under 1,000 people who could be moved either to another facility, although we were arguing for them to be released because, as we know, jails are pretrial primarily. So people are held there without actually having been found guilty. So even in Alameda County outside of San Francisco, which might be considered less progressive, 2020 opened up the possibility of making advances in the fight to close the Santa Rita jail due to the rapid escalation of COVID outbreaks across all prison and jail systems. But I think there was this moment around COVID, even before the uprisings, where there was some movement around being able to get people released, given that prisons and jails were becoming petri dishes for COVID. So unfortunately, in this time of rolling back gains, because of the pull toward the right, we're seeing a disciplining coming from the federal level with the recent Supreme Court ruling that effectively criminalized homelessness. Governor Newsom has been given free rein to target homeless people across the state. San Francisco Mayor London Breed needed no second opinion, and within this last few months has been sweeping people off the streets in droves, and similar sweeps have unfolded in Oakland. And so that's what this has meant, is that the jail population is on the rise across counties, across the state, undoing many of our efforts. And in a city like San Francisco, which has a abundance of housing stock that's empty, it's being used right as as capital, but not actually as a public good, right? So there's definitely more to be done with fighting jailing, and while critical resistance isn't currently part of a campaign around that, I do think one is needed in the Bay Area. So lastly, I'm going to do a quick overview of the state of imprisonment. So the dynamic that has shaped the work around imprisonment for the last 10 years has been started with the overcrowding crisis that we had at the beginning of the 2010s. California prisons were operating at 137% capacity, and those of us who were fighting around that issue were part of a difficult struggle to release people from prison. In response to the overcrowding crisis, the state of California, which had stopped building prisons, so California had been on a 20-year building prison boom since the 1980s, but because of our efforts and the efforts of anti-prison advocates, had stopped building prisons. So that then resulted in, they stopped building prison, but kept putting people in there. So then it became overcrowded. California then instituted a policy called realignment, where they would expand local capacity at the county level and realign their imprisonment process to be managed by the county, right? Causing a boom in jail construction projects across the state, which is one we fought in San Francisco and won against that jail. But there are multiple counties across the state that didn't have jails, but suddenly had jails pop up, right? So we continue to engage over this last decade in multiple fights to change punitive sentencing. So things like life without parole and 3 strikes, which, you can get 3 misdemeanors and that counts as a felony, and then you get imprisoned. But in this last decade, because of the opening that's been provided, we were able to move forward with Prop 47, which essentially reclassified many low-level felony charges as misdemeanors. And this resulted in a dramatic decrease in the prison population by 2020. So in 2020, we figured that since the prison population was going down, that this was and there was all this empty prison bed space, we could close some prisons, right? So we launched a campaign to get 10 prisons named for closure by the governor by 2025. So we've successfully gotten 4 prisons named for closure and 2 are already closed. Thank you. However, once again, the poll to the right rears its head. Governor Newsom, in concert with capitalist proponents across the state, has introduced Prop 36, which would essentially reverse the gains of Prop 47, recriminalize some low-level offenses. So we understand this to be an existential threat to both our campaign, but also all of the gains that we've been making around prison population reduction over the past decade. So there's a lot of work to do, which I keep saying. But so please join us in the fight to close prisons in California. And if you can't, then please this November vote no on Prop 36. That's the last thing I'll say there. So in conclusion, I just want to uplift a few things about the terrain and how we've engaged it over the last decade. These movements and fights that I've mentioned were all like multiracial, multi-sectoral fights. Even though the rate of jailing and imprisonment of Black people is higher in the Bay and everywhere, these different policing and imprisonment projects that I mentioned were designed to target different communities. For instance, for just one example, Urban Shield emerged from a partnership with Homeland Security and Homeland Security funds, and was initially targeting Muslim and Arab communities. But our understanding of solidarity and its impacts on all communities across the Bay Area meant that we pulled together a fight that was coming from multiple different communities to defeat that project, and that was why it was so successful. Lastly, the rise locally and globally of the right clearly threatens to roll back all of these victories. There's a way that those of us who are fighting policing and imprisonment see that the far right can and will exercise dominance through state violence if we are to succeed in our liberatory projects, then we have to contend with the amount of capacity that the apparatus of violence makes up of the state at every level, right? How much 30 to 50% of a municipality's budget can go to policing, rate of the general funds. And we need that for other things. So I encourage all of us to do more organizing to fight policing, jailing, and imprisonment for the sake of solidarity with Black people, but also for all of our sakes. Thank you.
Thanks for sharing your very insightful thoughts on this important theme. To summarize, it was great how you mapped the mitigating factors which led to the mobilization over the past decade and the concerted countermeasures that have been put in place to push back against all the progress which has been made as well. I liked that you ended on the note to call for organizing, which is always a good note to end on. So in terms of questions, I have a couple, but we can ask from the audience first. So maybe we can ask 3 questions at a time, and then Woods can answer.
Hi, Woods. Thank you so much for your talk. My name is Vivek. And my question is about organizing against police, especially when it comes to fissures in class. I think many people who are poor or, don't have a lot of wealth or capital understand the oppressive structure of the police, to their role to protect property and capital and extract value from poor people. My question is more about middle class or wealthy people who often will go to bat for the police, whether or not they view the role as they see it as the police is protecting them. And I'm wondering if you think that if it's worthwhile to try to organize people with more wealth against the police, or where we can make the most gains when it comes to actually, in popular opinion, rolling back the support of the police, and then hopefully towards reducing funding and things like that? Thank you.
Hi, I really like to talk. My name is Agniva. I wanted to ask you about what thoughts you have regarding the role that a lot of mainstream media has played in this, like by creating this mass hysteria about like cities being the crime rates growing insanely high. And I mean like even liberal media, like New York Times has published some really damning articles, which are propaganda pieces for the police, for instance. So just like what sort of steps can be taken to mitigate the damage done by the mainstream media on that regard? Thank you.
One more here.
Hi, my name is Ganesh. Thank you for the talk again. And I wanted to touch on two topics and get your inputs on. One was private prisons and companies like CCA and Geo Group, etc. And I heard something about some pullback in California, that there's some pushback. I just wanted to get your thoughts on that. And the other one was school resource officers. Anything that you would have to... School resource officers?
Do you want to answer these and then we can go to the next set?
Sure. Yes, these are great questions. Thank you for asking. On the topic of I'm going to start with the media question. I think that, so there is, I mean, as you were saying at the beginning of your question, there is a particular role that the media has played, especially the ways in which it has been, mainstream media has been like pretty captured by a conservative, the conservative wing of the capitalist class. There are like a few outliers, but not many. And I guess the dynamic that we have been seeing is similar to, I think, the dynamic that was happening in the late 70s, early 80s, where there was a, both a social crisis that was a manifestation of both the economic and political crises that were happening at that time. And instead of resolving those, there was a way in which, I think one of my elders, Ruth Wilson Gilmore, says, crime went up, crime came down, and then policing and prisons, the boom happened after that, right? So there's like a way in which there's the question of like the difference between what's considered harm and what's considered a crime, because those are two different things. And then there is, based on what's considered a crime, like how the media exacerbates what's happening, right? And so what happened just in 2020 is, there was a social and political crisis. There an economic crisis caused by COVID. Some people engaged in taking things that they needed. That escalated, went down, and then we have a media crisis about there being crime everywhere. It's running rampant. It's destroying everything. It's why all of these. It's why malls are closing and businesses are leaving, even though the businesses that are closing and malls that are closing actually have are those not actually a corollary. They're making decisions that actually about their economic interests, but then blaming it on the rise in crime. And essentially where we're left off with is having to fight Prop 36. And part of how we're doing it is one, as the young person was just saying, we produce our own media in response on social media. So we do grassroots media, we engage, we put together videos, we put together infographics, we release them online, and then we work to combat the narrative collectively in the mainstream media wherever we can. So when there's an argument put out, we put together letters to the editor, we will write an op-ed in response, we will, as we're drumming up interest in our counter narrative to what's happening in the mainstream, then we'll try and get op-eds or full hard news pieces placed in mainstream newspapers. And we've had some success, I think, particularly with the LA Times, which is really great. So that's one way that has happened, at least in California, that I think is really effective. I'll go faster because now I'm finally going to Okay, so for private prisons, and I think there's what we're seeing with private prisons is they make up historically and at present a very small part of the larger imprisonment apparatus, but they are really intense. They are a really real threat in the realm of immigration policing and imprisonment. There are some really great organizing happening with a campaign called Dignity Not Detention that is working to both shut down public and private facilities, and had a really fantastic gain where they have been halting California's work to enter into contracts with ICE, and have also secured funding to be rerouted from the state to local communities, instead of those funds going to contracts with private prisons. So that's been really important, but there's still the dynamic going back and forth. There was just an announcement made. A group of us are going to meet around on Monday, Tuesday of next week, because there's been an announcement that, with Kamala Harris's most recent sort of announcement about being tough on border policing, that now ICE is thinking about launching a bunch of local facilities along the Arizona border up through California and even in the Bay Area. And we'll be, I'm assuming, partnering with the Geo Group as part of that. So for SROs, which is school resource officers, I think thinking about what was mentioned earlier about the school to prison pipeline. I think that having police in schools is terrible for young people. There's been pretty successful campaigns across the country, and even in Oakland, the Black Organizing Project waged a campaign to get the Oakland police force out of Oakland city schools, and they were able to win in 2020. But essentially, Oakland City schools, a lot of elementary schools had cops, but not counselors, right? So, there's so many just egregious cases all across the country where I've heard of school resource officers handcuffing 5-year-olds, which is just surreal. So I do think that there are lots of organizations who have come up with, and I think that actually in the school to prison pipeline and youth policing and imprisonment, I think the movement nationally has actually been, I think, pretty successful in like rolling down the rate of juvenile detention. You can see it happening across the country, which is really excellent. Whether or not we're able to get the funds that from the general fund to then be rerouted back into schools is a different story. I know that the teachers are fighting really hard for that. And I wish them luck and look forward to getting to work with them more on being able to do that as well. And then lastly, for organizing middle class people, I think we have to organize everyone we can. So yes, I think that we should definitely organize middle class people. We should organize wealthy people if we can, if they want to become class traders and give us their money. Yes, please do that. I think the how they're, I think we run campaigns and try and shift the discourse, try and shift the landscape. I think in 2020, people across the political spectrum were actually open to the idea of thinking about defunding policing because we were capturing the mainstream narrative. And I think that engaging in concrete campaigns to shift resources and power and capacity away from policing is the material basis for this work, but then really being able to engage in the media terrain of struggle in sharp and tactical ways that reach the concerns of middle class people, I think will be important to do that. To win over who we can. I think that it'll most likely be people of color in that middle class of folks. That's what I got. Thank you.
So next set of questions. I would just like to interject with one question of my own. So this also connects back to the first session where we were talking about what are the movements and thoughts in the left to counter this multiracial right, which is emerging. So the emergence of Hindu supremacy in the US is problematic on many fronts, but it also directly or indirectly fuels into this myth of model minority, which fuels into this prison industrial complex here. And they also directly fund and fuel into the prison incarceratory system in India as well, where also you find overrepresentation of minorities, including Dalits and Adivasis and Muslims. So how should alliances between these different movements be forged? So how do you envision a future where we forge these alliances? Questions from the audience?
I have a very limited knowledge about the police system works here, but my question is in terms of police hiring, does the community or the campuses have any say or can influence, or organizations can influence how hiring process in policing works in that community? For example, which community the police are coming from or being hired, and how the benefits are. And in terms of the unions that they represent, for example, do you think the unions, the police as a union, as a labor union, are those ideology and stands are much different or similar than the police as an industry as itself? Can you comment anything about that?
Hi, thank you so much, Woods, for that insight into what organizing in this space looks like. My question, I'm Palashi, by the way. My question is about surveillance technologies and how they're emerging in the organizing fight that you are seeing, especially in the Bay Area, and how technologically sort of influenced it is. Because I am involved with some efforts in San Diego where ShotStopper and the smart streetlights projects have been really rolled forward without sort of consent from the communities, and we're having a hard time sort of fighting there. So I'm curious about if there are wins here or strategies here that have worked, as well as if there are other challenges that have emerged within surveillance tech that the rest of the country is yet to see, but are sort of already happening in the Bay Area. Thank you.
We'll do one last question and then.
So I get the last questions. In year 2000, when I came, the President Clinton was called the first black president, right? So supposedly. But in the last weeks of presidency, what he signed numerous bills. One of the bills is to open up the prison industrial complex. I read an article about that, right? Is there a way to repeal that, whatever the papers he has signed? This is one part, because that's, since then it has grown, the private prison complex. And another question is that 2 years ago we had the Prop 16, affirmative action. Is there a way to bring in for voting again all over so that we can put back the affirmative action in California? And after the actual African American president, that is Obama, came in on board, how did he really kind of one vicious cycle from high school to prison complex, right? Did he do anything at all so that the cycle is solved? Right? Thanks.
All right. Juicy. I like it. I like it. Okay, great. So let's see, which one do I want to start with? I'll just go in order. Okay. So to your question around forging alliances across movement, something that, once again, I'm going to reference Ruth Wilson Gilmore. She says is the look for what is taking the biggest bite out of communities, like everyday lives. What people are trying to live their lives and are being disrupted by like monopoly racial capitalism and its tentacles, and that goes that also has impacts the prison industrial complex and policing and imprisonment. So I think an example I can go back and reference is Urban Shield. Just to go a little bit more deeply into that, that training had scenarios, and part of it was a war games, and so the scenarios would have targets that you had to neutralize, and the policing team that neutralized the most targets was the team that won, and the targets were racialized. They were racialized Black, they were racialized Arab, they were racialized Muslim, they were racialized Latino, even though they would be like mannequins, or they were political actors. So they were leftists engaging in an uprising, and they had that to be neutralized, right? And so because that was the case, so that was one part of it. Another part of it is that the Proud Boys would regularly also attend and have a booth at the Weapons Expo. So there was a way in which the Sheriff Ahern of Alameda County was collaborating or coordinating with far right, like explicitly far right militia groups. And then, so that's the second part. And then the third part of it is that some of the different police groups that internationally would attend as part of the war games included like Israeli militarized police forces, included militarized police forces from the Philippines. So it was international, and basically police forces from countries that were engaging in war crimes and were like right wing and policing their communities were then all coming to the Bay Area and exchanging those tools and tactics. And so we understood that we needed to operate in the same way. And so we had to organize across community. And so that meant that there was participation from, Arab and Muslim communities. There was participation from the Chicano and Latino community. There's participation from our Filipino comrades. There's participation from Black Lives Matter, and all of us coordinated across a multiracial effort to stop this, and then therefore forge stronger bonds and of understanding and politically through this process that we still draw on to this day, right? So that it was the same group of people that are also regularly coordinating in response to the genocide in Palestine right now, right? And so it's because of those relationships that were forged in 2016 that we're able to draw on again. So that's points there. And then for the question around hiring, the truth of the matter is that we've done a lot of, not we as in my organization, but there's been a lot of historic work done around shifting hiring, like where the communities of where police come from are. Can it be people who are coming from the communities that can it be you live in the community that you police? Unfortunately, we find that even if the officer is Black, especially if the officer is Black, especially if the officer comes from that community, the actual rates of violence are actually higher. And what critical resistance argues is that there is something inherent about the institution of policing, as our comrade in the back was saying, around the role that it actually plays in society of protecting property instead of protecting people. That means that there isn't a way to move a different person into a position that would actually result in reducing the amount of harm that people are experiencing at the hands of policing. And that for the question of unions, the difficulty around police unions, exactly. There's a lot I could say about so there's the role that police play in relationship to unions historically, right? So part of what police initially were meant to do in response to unions were to stop them from making gains, right? Because of what their role is. And part of moving police as they professionalized during the Keynesian period in between the 1930s and 1960s, early is that it was meant to, in the eyes of the middle class, make sure that they were seen as valid and professionals. Right before that, I think they were seen as what they are, which are goons for the capitalist class. And I think that where we're at now is that after decades of both professionalization and the power that police associations have within the larger union ecosystem, that that's going to be a difficult site to try and come at in terms of moving them from that place. How much power they have, both in terms of electoral politics, but then at the municipal and state level, but then also and in terms of like their ability to wield that power on behalf of police, like the police officers, means that there's also room that workers can actually take based on like those benefits. And so I think we kind of have to we have to be really thoughtful about power, like institutions of power and power dynamics. And so there are folks who are trying to think about ways of like shrinking the power of police associations without that having an adverse effect on the larger union movement. But I don't think we've quite figured that out yet. And so unfortunately that means in terms of like standards, we don't actually have the power to put the kind of pressure that even we would want to limit what they're able to do via that as a site of struggle. In terms of the question of Clinton, so I would actually argue that the Clinton is where the sort of like right-wing push that was like that had, I think, really started to crystallize with neoliberalism in the early 70s really was able to come to fruition in the Democratic Party, but that the police and prison boom had started in the 80s, right? So there's like the war on gangs, the war on poverty, the war on crime, like all of that was happening in the 80s. And that it was able to really be perfected in the 90s, right? And so the 94 crime bill that Joe Biden introduced is actually sort of one of the sites of like culmination of these efforts at the national level. And there is legislation that like Cori Bush introduced on behalf of Movement for Black Lives to repeal the 94 crime bill, and introduced the People's Response Act, which was just like policy that was written by organizers who think about policing imprisonment all the time, like me, and that hasn't gotten much traction. And now that Cori Bush has been pushed out of office because of AIPAC, then we're gonna have to rethink about how we're gonna be able to actually make that go. And that has to do with like the balance of forces, right? So like it would be great to be able to repeal the 94 crime bill, but we're a ways from that, unfortunately. Especially when thinking about Kamala Harris, her history and her allegiances potentially moving into the White House. And Trump, I think it's going to be a challenge, a contradiction that we have to navigate in this particular arena, either way. I mean, in all arenas, but it's going to be challenging. Obama doing anything for the school to prison pipeline, not to my knowledge, proactively. If there's anything that was done, it was coming from the organizing that was happening, that people were doing across multiple cities. I think the Advancement Project was doing a really strong campaign around the school to prison pipeline, and and then there's been really, like I was saying earlier, really winning efforts around juvenile detention centers and closing those, and having young people be rerouted. And then lastly, on surveillance technologies, I think that is, and whether or not there's been gains there, I think that's a little challenging, unfortunately. Yeah, I'm trying to think about like optimistic material gains. There's just like really, really far gone when you think about something like fusion centers and where all of this data that's being collected by things like ShotSpotter are being aggregated. But one thing I will say is that there's a reliance of surveillance in relationship to policing. Like somebody actually has to go and use the surveillance information via policing. And I think so that's like if we are struggling to stop the technology, given what is the mainstream level of surveillance that we're all kind of experiencing, much less the sort of criminalized level of surveillance, then it might make sense to organize at the site of policing the actual people who have to then go and use that technology in order to make decisions around who to arrest.
Thanks once again for sharing your insights on grassroots organizing. It was very thought-provoking, I'm sure. And we will close the session now, but Wits will be around if people want to have discussions later. Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. Lots of things to think about, lots to do.
Please, I'm sure. Are you sure it's going to be quick? Let's see.
I just want you to say a little bit more about Proposition 36 and the kind of work that's going to happen over the next 2 months to stop it.
Yes.
And also, if there's anything around schools that is ongoing in the border area that people can plug into. I mean, it's all about how can people here plug into something.
Fantastic. Yes. Okay. So school specific, because I have mentioned plug into the prison closure campaign. If you want to plug into the Stop San Pablo Cop City campaign, you can definitely do that. You can reach out to me. I can support with that. And then, okay. So the question, 2 questions. First is, so both what's happening around schools and what's happening around Prop 36. Okay, so there's organizing that's happening by several groups, the VERA, the ACLU, multiple community-based organizations. We're all doing different components of that work. I can share a link with the organizers of different ways, depending on what kind of work you want to do, whether it's media work, whether it's door knocking, whether it's public education, et cetera, et cetera. And we're coming at it from all levels, right? So we'll be, there's going to be door knocking across the state. There's going to be regular presentations around Prop 36. And I'm on the group of people who's working around trying to engage in media interventions around it. And it is, it's dangerous, and we definitely welcome more people to get involved, and happy to connect folks around that. I hope that answers your question. If you need to, okay, great. And then for fighting around schools particularly, I know schools is a complicated issue, especially what just happened in Georgia, what's been happening, is the sort of ecosystem of like imperialist violence reflected within the culture, even down to young people, right? And then also like right wing specifically violence, because like think about actually who it's like young white boys who are doing this, and they're oftentimes like harming their families and then going to schools, you know, so like it's and their moms particularly, which is like okay, so I think there's a tension there that I think definitely needs to be considered about schools and right-wing violence more broadly, but and I'm happy to talk about it. But there's in terms of a campaign for people to engage in around school police. I'm trying to think about what's happening right now. I think the Advancement Project is the right place to look at. I think that the Black Organizing Project is the organization that won the campaign around school. You know what? They're trying to defend that victory. So that's happening in Oakland specifically. I can do some digging around if there are things that are happening closer to here, but they're trying to defend that victory to keep Oakland Police Department out of Oakland schools. Yeah.
So
That's it.